In the winter of 1941, the world's newest and most dangerous supply route cut across the top of the globe, a corridor so violent and unpredictable that sailors called it the Ice Highway to Hell. As the first Arctic convoys departed from Scapa Flow under Operation Dervish, few among the British escort groups realized they were stepping into a gauntlet of storms, U-boats, and unexplained moments of silence that still puzzle historians today. The Royal Navy had escorted merchant ships before, but nothing in the Atlantic or Mediterranean prepared them for the blinding snow squalls, magnetic anomalies, and sudden radio blackouts awaiting them in the Barents Sea. The struggle began the moment the ships left the safety of the Orkney Islands. HMS Nigeria, a Crown Colony-class cruiser assigned as flagship for several early convoys, pushed north with destroyers from the 6th Escort Group, veterans like HMS Onslow and HMS Offa. Their crews soon discovered the convoys were not simply logistical operations but endurance trials waged against nature itself. Gale-force winds hammered the ship's broadside, throwing green water over the forecastle and freezing the bow guns in thick crusts of ice. Men chipped ice for hours at a time just to keep their vessels stable. A single miscalculation in these uncharted waters could turn a destroyer into a drifting iceberg. Yet these hardships were recorded in logs. They were expected. What wasn't expected were the sudden disappearances of radio traffic, windows of silence that occurred without warning. In late October 1941, as the convoy neared the approaches to Murmansk, the escort screen reported moments when wireless transmissions dropped out, not for seconds but for minutes at a time. These weren't the typical atmospheric disturbances common in high latitudes. They were unusually complete blackouts, wiping out both short-range and long-range signals. In the words of a signalman aboard HMS Nigeria, for a moment it was as if the sea had swallowed every voice. To understand these gaps, it's important to consider the technological limits of the era. British HF/DF or Huff Duff was capable of detecting U-boat transmissions, but the Arctic Circle presented new variables: solar storms, polar ionospheric drift, and the relentless interference of the aurora borealis. Admiralty communications analysts admitted privately that the Barents Sea was a communications frontier unlike anything the Royal Navy had encountered. Still, the logs from the early convoys show more than just environmental challenges. They record instances when multiple ships simultaneously lost contact, even though they sat miles apart under the same clear conditions. A diary entry from a junior officer aboard HMS Harrier hints at the unease these silences caused. When the set went dead, we thought it was jamming. But there was no sound, no static, just a total absence of the world. Aboard the destroyers, rumors spread quickly. Some believed the Germans were experimenting with new jamming equipment. Others blamed the Soviet coastline's primitive radar stations. A few whispered that it was something far simpler, an Allied equipment flaw quietly acknowledged but never publicly admitted. But whatever the cause, the effect was always the same. Ships found themselves momentarily alone in seas where being alone could mean being dead. These incidents grew more frequent as the convoy entered the Barents Sea, an expanse where visibility could plummet from miles to mere meters in minutes. Snowstorms swept down from the Arctic ice cap with unimaginable speed, blanketing the escorts in whiteout conditions. With radio communications unreliable, the ships relied heavily on Morse signal lamps and flares, methods that were painfully slow and often lost to the blizzard. Masters of merchant ships later testified they sometimes saw nothing but shadows of escorts drifting in and out of view like ghosts, unable to confirm whether they were friend, foe, or ice. And yet, despite these challenges, the convoys pressed on. The crews knew that every ton of material they delivered, Hawker Hurricanes, ammunition crates, spare parts, tinned food, was vital to the Soviet defense of Leningrad and Moscow. The stakes were so high that even incomplete logs were tolerated, provided the ships arrived. It was this pressure that may explain why certain anomalies were not recorded with full detail. The survival of the mission simply outweighed the documentation of unexplained phenomena. But historians continue to ask, were these communication gaps purely natural? Or were they early signs of German intelligence testing new capabilities that the Allies did not fully understand at the time? As the convoy finally reached Murmansk, battered but intact, the escorts waited for a moment of relief that never quite came. Questions lingered over what had happened in those isolated pockets of silence. The Arctic, vast and unforgiving, had offered no answers. And in the months that followed, those unanswered questions would only deepen as the convoys faced far deadlier dangers on the journey back south. The tragedy and confusion surrounding Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 remain some of the most hotly debated episodes of the entire Arctic campaign. Yet beyond the devastation of the scattered merchant ships, there lies another layer of mystery, one involving the escort vessels themselves, several of which slipped into hours-long gaps of unrecorded movements. This part of the story begins with a little-known detail. The Admiralty's fateful message to scatter. The convoy not only tore merchant ships apart, it plunged the escort screen into chaos that has never been fully reconstructed. PQ-17 departed Hvalfjord, Iceland, on June 27, 1942 with a formidable escort force. The close escorts included destroyers like HMS Keppel, Leamington, and Ledbury, reinforced by the anti-aircraft ship HMS Allenbank and a ring of corvettes. They were supported at distance by larger forces, cruisers HMS London and USS Tuscaloosa, and eventually by heavy units including battleship HMS Duke of York. American and British crews worked side by side, sharing radar plots and intelligence reports in a region where every square mile of ocean could conceal a lurking U-boat. The struggle ramped up between the 2nd and the 4th of July, as Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft began shadowing the convoy with relentless precision. Ju-88 circled above the formation, radioing course updates back to U-boat packs lying in wait. Tension rippled across the escort decks. Sailors knew they were being tracked, but they could do nothing to outrun the German aircraft in the narrow confines of the Arctic Basin. Despite the constant threat, discipline remained firm, until the Admiralty message arrived. On the evening of July 4th, following intelligence reports suggesting the German battleship Tirpitz had put to sea, the Admiralty issued the now infamous order, "Convoy is to scatter." The decision shattered the cohesion of the formation in minutes. Merchant ships turned in every direction, their captains attempting to flee across fog, ice, and open water. The escorts, trained to protect the convoy as a group, were suddenly forced into independent action. This is where the historical record grows uncertain. Logs from HMS Keppel, the senior officer escort ship, show a flurry of commands as she attempted to gather small groups of merchants and guide them through the chaos. But there are large gaps, blocks of several hours, where her precise movements remain unclear. Similar voids appear in the logs of HMS Allenbank and the destroyer HMS Ledbury. Some entries appear after the fact, possibly reconstructed or summarized in retrospect. Others simply skip forward, leaving historians to question what transpired during those missing hours. A surviving junior officer's diary from Keppel provides a glimpse into this moment. He wrote, "The sea was torn apart by ships fleeing in all directions. We received signals I could not verify, fragments. Some came from vessels I could not identify, others from no known source at all." The entry suggests a breakdown not only in formation but in communication integrity. Escort captains reported hearing short bursts of Morse traffic, some garbled, some incomplete, believed to be distress calls. Yet the same logs show that at least 2 of these signals did not match any merchant ship later confirmed sunk. Who sent them remains unknown. The reveal came decades later, when declassified Admiralty documents indicated that some of the escort movements may have been intentionally redacted. Intelligence officers feared that revealing the convoy's full response to Tirpitz might inadvertently expose ultra-intercept capabilities. As a result, historians suspect that certain navigational details and operational decisions were either compressed or removed from the original war diaries before archiving. But this explanation doesn't account for all discrepancies. For example, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos taken on July 5 show a destroyer-shaped silhouette at a position none of the escorts reported occupying at that time. German naval records described it simply as a single fast escort, steaming northeast at speed. No Allied log places any British or American escort on that bearing until much later. This uncorrelated sighting, still unclaimed by any known vessel, remains a point of contention in the analysis of PQ-17's final hours. The disaster continued as U-boats and aircraft pounced on the scattered ships. Out of 35 merchant vessels, 24 were lost. Escort vessels rescued survivors where possible, but they too struggled with exhaustion, fog, and limited fuel. When the surviving escorts regrouped at Madigan Strait and Archangel, some ships bore unexplained splinter damage or reported fuel usage inconsistent with their documented courses. It was as though they had undertaken emergency maneuvers or brief engagements never recorded in official logs. Modern analysts see in PQ-17 a lesson in the dangers of intelligence-driven panic. The Admiralty's fear of Tirpitz, never confirmed to be approaching the convoy, triggered a cascade of decisions that made historical reconstruction nearly impossible. When logs were later compiled for official reports, they were shaped not only by memory and confusion but by a wartime culture of secrecy. As the surviving ships gathered in Soviet ports, crews whispered about the missing hours, the moments when escorts vanished from sight, only to reappear battered and silent. And these quiet questions would follow the Arctic convoys into the next months, when even stranger incidents unfolded in waters where sunlight rarely touched the waves. In the winter of 1942, with the Arctic convoys suffering unprecedented losses, the Allied command turned to a force that had trained for cold weather operations but had yet to test itself in the brutal northern seas, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 8. Their arrival in Iceland marked a quiet but significant shift in Arctic strategy. Few remember it today, but a curious and still unresolved sighting during those joint patrols would become one of the most debated mysteries of the Arctic convoy escorts. The struggle began with integration. American destroyers like USS Rogers DD-254, Worden's DD-352, and Babbitt DD-128 had spent months conducting anti-submarine sweeps in the North Atlantic, but the move into waters between Iceland and Jan Mayen Island presented an entirely new challenge. Temperatures plunged low enough to freeze depth charge rails. Radar sets, still new to many American crews, sometimes malfunctioned in the polar cold. Fuel consumption rose sharply as the destroyers fought fierce headwinds simply to maintain formation speed. The British, experienced but exhausted, welcomed U.S. reinforcements. Joint commands were established at Valfjord, and shared patrols became a daily rhythm. Captains exchanged notes on German tactics, particularly the shadow wolf technique, U-boats trailing convoys silently for hours before transmitting contact reports. But enemy submarines were only one threat. The Arctic itself constantly tested the escorts' endurance, shrouding them in fog so thick that even the masthead lamps disappeared into a wall of gray. Amid this tension, an incident occurred on December 14, 1942 during a joint patrol northeast of Iceland. A British Sunderland flying boat from No. 201 Squadron RAF, tracking the outer perimeter of the convoy route, reported an unknown vessel at extreme visual range. The aircraft described it as roughly destroyer-sized, low in the water, long silhouette, minimal superstructure, steaming parallel to the patrol line before disappearing into a dense bank of fog. The Sunderland's commander, Flight Lieutenant Harold Drayton, radioed the sighting to the nearest escorts, USS Rogers and HMS Matchless. Neither ship reported seeing anything. The insight offered in after-action reports shows how unsettled the crews were. The American logbook for Rogers noted, responded to aircraft contact report at 1,432 hours. Radar negative. Visibility variable. No vessel sighted on directed course. Meanwhile, the British destroyer Matchless recorded something more ambiguous, observed faint shapes in fog, uncertain if shadow or vessel. A sonar operator later told a naval historian that the crew believed they'd picked up a brief metallic echo on Astic, too faint to classify but not ice. What makes this event unusual is the fusion of incomplete evidence. U-boats typically did not operate on the surface during daylight near Iceland. German destroyers and torpedo boats had no operational reason to be there. Surface raiders like Hipper or Lutzow were hundreds of miles away. Intelligence intercepts from Ultra revealed no planned Kriegsmarine surface presence in the area that week. In a post-war interview, Drayton insisted he had not mistaken the vessel for a trawler or icebreaker. It was a warship, he said. What side she was on I couldn't say, but she moved with purpose. His Sunderland co-pilot supported the claim, describing the ship as dark-hulled and traveling at significant speed. The reveal came decades later from U.S. Navy archives. Task Force 8 destroyers were under orders to avoid disclosing certain radar test operations conducted that month. The Americans were experimenting with new calibration techniques using remote maneuvers, some of which intentionally broke formation to test detection range. Still, historians argue this does not align with the Sunderland sighting, as no American destroyer was listed within that bearing until much later in the day. Declassified communications reveal no unlogged U.S. vessel operating independently at that time. Modern naval analysts propose alternative explanations, light distortions, sea mirages, or a misidentified Allied ship caught in heavy fog. But several details resist easy answers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance recorded no German surface units. The convoy route was under intense Allied surveillance. And in a region where every ship counted, an unaccounted for silhouette remains deeply out of place. The human side of the incident left its own mark. American and British crews later recounted the eerie quiet that followed the sighting report. The fog thickened around Rogers and Matchless, swallowing sound. Visibility shrank to only a few dozen meters. Lookouts stood double watches, scanning for shapes emerging from the haze. Officers whispered about the unrecorded silhouette, unsure whether it represented a threat, a lost ship, or something more mundane but misinterpreted under extreme conditions. The application for modern analysts is clear. In warfare, uncertainty is not just possible, it is constant. Even with radar, sonar, and air cover, the Arctic possessed the power to erase certainty as quickly as it erased visibility. Not every question has a definitive answer, even in meticulously logged operations. As the joint patrol concluded and the ships returned to Icelandic waters, no further sightings were reported. But the question lingered in after-action conferences, never fully resolved. What vessel had moved through the fog that day in December 1942? The Arctic, silent as ever, offered no reply, leaving yet another shadow on the Convoy Escorts' already perilous mission. By early 1943, Allied planners believed they understood the Arctic convoy's greatest threats: U-boats, Luftwaffe torpedo bombers, and the unpredictable fury of the northern seas. But the story of Convoy JW-53 revealed another danger, one far older and more unforgiving than any military adversary. It began with a surprising historical footnote. JW-53, launched on February 15, 1943, sailed directly into one of the worst Arctic storms of the war, a storm so punishing that even modern meteorologists struggle to explain its sudden intensity. Yet hidden within accounts of this ferocious weather is a more obscure mystery involving a series of unconfirmed light signals reported by one of the convoy's escorts, HMS Harrier. The struggle of JW-53 unfolded long before the convoy reached enemy waters. Waves rose higher than the masts of the smaller escorts. Blizzards swept across the formation, turning the world into a white void where sky and sea merged. The minesweeper HMS Harrier, part of the 6th minesweeping flotilla assigned to assist the convoy's safe passage, struggled mightily. Her crew chipped ice from her decks every hour to prevent capsizing. Men worked in freezing spray until their fingers bled. On some ships, anti-aircraft guns froze in place, and compasses behaved erratically under magnetic stress. Despite these conditions, the escorts pressed on, guided by a combination of dead reckoning, instinct, and fragmented radio reports. The convoy's commanding officer, Captain Robert Sherbrooke aboard HMS Milne, noted in his logs that visibility varied from merely poor to utterly impossible. In those moments of near-total blindness, the convoy's tight formations dissolved into scattered clusters of ships relying on nothing but sound signals, fog horns, klaxons, and the occasional flare punching weakly through the white wall. It was during one of these blinding storms on February 23, somewhere north of Bear Island, that HMS Harrier reported something unusual. At approximately 0200 hours, lookouts spotted a series of faint rhythmic flashes on the starboard horizon, 3 short bursts followed by one long. The pattern resembled a coded lamp signal, but it did not match any known Royal Navy recognition code. Nor did it correspond to German naval light signaling patterns documented at Bletchley Park. The fog parted just enough for the crew to see the glow, but not the source, before it vanished again behind swirling snow. The insight from Harrier's war diary captures the crew's confusion. Lights observed at extreme distance. Bearing uncertain. No ship identified. Suspect optical illusion caused by storm or reflection off ice. Further investigation impossible. And yet several crewmen later insisted the lights were deliberate, too structured to be random refractions. A petty officer reported seeing a vertical glimmer as if from a masthead, though never fully visible. Another described the brightness as warmer than reflected lightning, suggesting combustion rather than atmospheric distortion. The escort group attempted to close on the position, but pack ice blocked their approach. HMS Harrier and the destroyer HMS Whitehall forced their way through slush, grinding past small floes that threatened to tear open their hulls. When they finally reached the bearing of the sighting, they found nothing, no ship, no wreckage, not even disturbed water that might hint at a vessel's recent movement. The storm closed in again soon after, erasing any hope of visual confirmation. The reveal came later when JW-53 reached the Kola Inlet. During damage assessments, one escort, HMS Integrity, a small minesweeper detached from the main formation, reported hull dents, scraped paint along her forward plating, and a bent starboard rail. Her captain attributed the damage to ice, but the pattern of impact suggested a more angled force, as if the vessel had bumped against an object rather than simply struck a floe head-on. Yet Integrity's log recorded no such collision. In fact, there was a 2-hour gap in the ship's war diary around the same time as Harrier's sighting. Analysts have argued for decades about whether Integrity's unrecorded course change and Harrier's mysterious lights are connected. Some historians believe the ship may have maneuvered suddenly to avoid a collision in heavy ice, leading to accidental damage not properly logged in the chaos. Others theorize that Integrity may have attempted to investigate the unknown lights independently, choosing not to record the episode to avoid scrutiny or criticism. But there is no evidence of enemy surface vessels in the area, and German records contain no mention of operations near JW-53 that night. The human element of the story is equally compelling. Sailors aboard Harrier later described the unsettling nature of the sighting, a sense that something was nearby in the storm, unseen but present. "You could feel it," one survivor recalled, "like the ice was hiding something." The Arctic's oppressive silence, punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the groaning of ice against steel, amplified every moment of uncertainty. From a modern standpoint, the incident offers a lesson in the limits of observation under extreme conditions. Fog, ice, and the refractive qualities of polar air can create illusions, bending light, duplicating shapes, or making distant objects appear closer or more structured than they truly are. Yet even the most conservative interpretations struggle to explain why multiple trained lookouts identified the signals as intentional patterns rather than random flashes. As JW-53 limped into Murmansk battered but intact, the official reports made only passing mention of HMS Harrier's light sighting. The matter never reached a formal inquiry. But the unanswered questions remain a footnote in Arctic escort history, an encounter swallowed by fog, hinted at in logs, remembered by sailors, and never fully resolved. And as the convoys pressed onward into 1944, the mysteries would grow only deeper. By late 1944, the Arctic convoys were no longer the desperate improvisations of earlier years. They were well-drilled operations guided by radar, sonar, escort carriers, and most critically, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park. But even in these final, more technologically sophisticated phases of the Arctic War, there were inconsistencies in the escort logs, moments where Allied ships moved, turned, or accelerated without explanation. At the center of this mystery lies a rarely discussed decrypted message hinting at a planned Kriegsmarine ambush near Bear Island, and the curious gaps in Allied records that followed. The hook begins with a document that remained classified for decades, a German naval intercept decoded by British cryptanalysts in November 1944. The message suggested that elements of the 13th U-boat flotilla had been ordered to concentrate north of Bear Island, forming a line designed to strike the next Allied convoy heading for the Kola Inlet. The intercept was fragmentary, portions were corrupted by transmission static, but Admiralty analysts believed it referenced an operation codenamed Ria Fenkent. Nothing in the decrypted traffic hinted at surface ships, but the implied concentration of submarines was troubling. The struggle for the escorts accompanying convoy JW-62, which departed Lock U on November 29, 1944, was not merely the threat of an ambush, it was the burden of acting on intelligence they were not fully permitted to understand. Escort commanders were told only that increased U-boat activity was expected, without details on how this information had been obtained. The destroyers HMS Campbell, Zambesi, and Carysfit, along with the frigates of the 19th Escort Group, adjusted their patrol lines accordingly. But several officers noted that some of the Admiralty's course change orders seemed anticipatory, arriving minutes before radar or HF/DF bearings suggested danger. The insight into the Ultra process reveals why. Because the intercepts were so sensitive, only a fraction of the message content reached the escort commanders at sea. Decision-making at sea became a puzzle, orders given without full context, cautions delivered without explanation, and sudden changes in formation that seemed driven by invisible factors. Aboard HMS Zambesi, a junior officer wrote in his private notes, "The captain keeps receiving signals whose origins we are not allowed to know. We alter course in calm seas for no apparent reason." These diary entries were never included in the ship's official archive. The reveal came on the night of December 2nd, when an unexpected maneuver occurred that historians still debate. At 2,310 hours, several escorts altered course sharply to the southeast. HMS Carysfit reported a sudden order to close in and increase speed, with no indication of the threat. Meanwhile, the frigate HMS Loch Dunvegan briefly vanished from the formation during a radar blackout caused by polar interference. Her log for the night of 2 to 3 December includes a half-page gap, with the next entry resuming abruptly, "Rejoin screen. Proceeding as ordered." No mention is made of her movements during the missing interval. Some speculation arose that Loch Dunvegan may have dropped depth charges on a suspected submarine contact without logging the event. Yet her magazines showed discrepancies afterward, 2 charges missing from inventory, though the official reason listed is rough seas. Other analysts have guessed the frigate was repositioned to intercept a U-boat whose presence was hinted at by ultra-decrypts too sensitive to disclose. But the Admiralty's version of events contains no such details. The most perplexing detail comes from a post-war analysis of Kriegsmarine records, which show no U-boat attacks reported at that time and no submarines operating exactly where the Allied escorts maneuvered so urgently. The Germans did send boats toward the Bear Island line, but several were delayed by mechanical issues or driven off by air patrols. Whatever the escorts reacted to that night, it was not a confirmed submarine presence. Yet the Allied ships behaved as though responding to a threat they believed to be immediate and real. When survivors of the convoy were interviewed after the war, several recalled the tension of that night. A leading seaman aboard HMS Campbell remembered the sudden speed increase. Engines roared as if we were about to engage something, but no one knew what. Lookouts were doubled. The sea was pitch black, you couldn't see the bow from the bridge. Another escort sailor admitted, it felt like the officers knew more than we did, but not enough to be sure. Modern naval historians have attempted to reconcile the inconsistencies. Some argue the escorts were responding to HF/DF bearings that later proved false due to atmospheric distortion. Others believe Admiralty signals officers may have issued mistaken orders based on misinterpreted intelligence. But a small number suggest deliberate omission, portions of the logs sanitized to protect ultra-secrecy, even after the danger had passed. The Arctic convoys of 1944 were battles not only against the enemy but against incomplete information. Officers were forced to follow shadows cast by intelligence they could not verify, reacting to threats they could not see. The missing log entries, unexplained maneuvers, and conflicting accounts from JW62 leave an impression of a fleet moving in two worlds, one dictated by the sea and one dictated by secrets. As the convoy entered the relative safety of Soviet air cover near the Kola Inlet, the tension eased. But the mysterious maneuvers remained unspoken, uninvestigated, and ultimately unrecorded in full. They would become another of the Arctic escort's silent questions, one that would linger as the war approached its final months, leading directly into the uncertainties explored in the final chapter. When the Arctic convoys ended in 1945, the guns finally quieted, and the last merchantman eased into the Kola Inlet under Soviet flag escorts, it seemed the story of the Northern Lifeline had reached a clear conclusion. Ships had been sunk, escorts had fought bravely, and the Allies had delivered millions of tons of material to the Eastern Front. But what survived the war was more than a record of victories and losses. It was a paper trail, fragmented, inconsistent, and riddled with omissions. And in those gaps lies the final and perhaps most enduring mystery of the Arctic escort operations. The hook begins with one simple fact. When British Admiralty teams attempted to consolidate ship logs, after-action reports, and convoy diaries from 1941 to 1944, they discovered that many records were incomplete. Some had missing pages. Others were rewritten in different handwriting. A few had entire nights summarized in a single vague line. The official explanation attributed these discrepancies to the pressures of wartime operation. But archivists who examined the files in the decades that followed observed patterns that suggested something more complex, a quiet, systematic pruning of certain details. The struggle to reconstruct a full and accurate account of the Arctic campaign reflects the chaos under which the escorts operated. Ships were battered by ice storms that caused log sheets to freeze or blow overboard. Officers wrote entries in darkness with numb fingers. But environmental hardship cannot fully explain the holes in the historical record. Consider HMS Keppel, senior escort for PQ-17, whose logs contain unexplained time jumps. Or HMS Harrier during JW-53, whose optical sighting report was reduced to a single sentence in the final draft. Or USS Rogers, whose radar contact entries on December 14, 1942 were later copied in summary form rather than preserved in their original, detailed state. The insight behind these inconsistencies comes from post-war intelligence policy. After Germany's surrender, the British government moved swiftly to control the narrative surrounding Ultra, the signals intelligence program that had allowed Bletchley Park to decrypt vast quantities of German communications. Thousands of documents were destroyed, sanitized, or kept classified for decades. Ships' logs that referenced unusual signals, unauthorized maneuvers, or orders inconsistent with visible threat were flagged for review. Some were quietly edited before entering the public record. One declassified memorandum from 1946 reveals the Admiralty's concern. Certain convoy escort logs contain language that may inadvertently reveal operational intelligence sources. Recommend redaction or summary in such cases. The memo does not specify which logs were altered, but its timing coincides with archival gaps found in several key convoy records, particularly those associated with U-boat shadowing and sudden course changes. Yet not all mysteries stem from classified intelligence. Some arise from the human experience of fighting in the Arctic, a realm so hostile that perception itself became unreliable. Crews described seeing phantom shapes in fog, hearing distant engines that never materialized, and encountering sudden patches of open water in regions charted as solid ice. Lookouts aboard HMS Whitehall swore they saw a ship's lights one stormy night during JW53, even though no vessel was recorded within dozens of miles. Similarly, an officer on HMS Campbell wrote of hearing a low mechanical hum while escorting JW62, though sonar detected nothing. Scientists now know that polar mirages, temperature inversions, and acoustic refraction can warp sight and sound in dramatic ways. A vessel below the horizon can appear lifted into view like a ghost. The creaking of ice can mimic distant engines. In an environment where night lasted months and fog could blind a ship's bridge in seconds, the Arctic became a theater of deception, not deliberate deception by the enemy, but deception created by nature itself. The reveal comes when historians attempt to reconcile contradictory eyewitness accounts with the incomplete logs left behind. Some stories match closely with recorded enemy operations. Others cannot be anchored to any known German movement. And a few, like the unclaimed destroyer silhouette sighted in 1942, or the unverified light signals near Bear Island, sit in a liminal space between verified history and unresolved memory. For modern naval analysts, these unanswered details offer a valuable lesson. Even in well-documented campaigns, the truth is rarely clean. War compresses time, erases context, and forces decisions made under exhaustion and fear. Logs are written by tired hands. Signals are misheard or misinterpreted. And intelligence, no matter how advanced, comes with shadows attached. Yet these gaps do not diminish the achievements of the Arctic escorts, they illuminate them. Crews operated under conditions harsher than any other theater of the war. They fought not just German U-boats and bombers but a sea that seemed intent on swallowing everything, including their records. The very fact that some details remain uncertain is a testament to how thin the line between survival and loss truly was. As the convoys drew to a close and escort ships returned to Scapa Flow, many sailors carried home memories they seldom spoke about: strange signals, unlogged encounters, unexplained maneuvers. Their war diaries ended, but their questions remained. Questions that historians still pursue today, not to solve every mystery, but to understand how so many could arise in a campaign fought under perpetual shadow. In the end, these unresolved fragments form the backbone of the Arctic convoy's final enigma. Not a single dramatic secret, but a constellation of small, lingering uncertainties, scattered across the barren sea like the lights of ships seen through fog. And together, they shape the story of the 5 enduring mysteries that still surround the escorts who kept the northern lifeline alive.